Welcome to the Creepin' It Real Show, your one-stop shop for weird news, movie reviews, otherworldly, and paranormal shenanigans. We'll take a dive into what's going on in creepy pop culture. You can follow Creepin' It Real Show on Twitter at creepin_it. You can email us at creepinitrealshow@gmail.com. And you can also go to our website, creepinitshow.com. Welcome to Creepin' It Real. I'm your host, Yardley, and it's a great day here in Atlanta, and I want to bring in my co-host from the great state of California. How are you doing, Moni?
A little rough this morning. I forgot that we were doing this. Not that I forgot that we do the podcast on Sundays, more that I forgot that it was Sunday because I've been a little bit on vacation mode. But other than that, pretty good. I'm excited to talk about this movie, and I'll just say right now, you were right. I did end up liking it. So thank you, Mr. Yardley, for introducing us to something new. Old.
Hey, no problem. And you know what? We're going to do something that we haven't done yet on the Creepin' It Real show. And I want to introduce everyone to Kinte Ferguson from indyradio.org. We have done tons of podcasts together. He's definitely my right-hand man in the podcast game, and he's the one who actually got me into podcasting. So he's going to join us today to talk Return of the Living Dead. What's up, Kinte?
Hey. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Hey, you sound like it's 8 o'clock in the morning where you're at. Hey.
Yeah.
And from right up the street, we've got Christy. What's going on?
Hello, everybody. I am probably still drunk, so just FYI.
Same.
I didn't go to bed last night until like 3:30, and ended up at the Oasis, Yardley. You probably know where that is. I gave Rick a surprise party down by the airport at this place called Hammers. And it was sand volleyball, and we had a ball. It was so much fun. It's actually our first date 17 years ago on his birthday was sand volleyball. So nice. It was kind of fun to recreate that. And then somehow ended up at a strip club. So right now I have sand and stripper cooties all over me and still drunk. And not quite sure, what fucking day it is. So I'm really happy Kinte's here. Let me just tell you.
I'm not. We should be I'm even losing my voice. I feel like we should be hosting someone more graciously.
No, he's a professional. He's going to make us look
he is.
real
He deserves better.
And I also have a head cold. So I'm I'm at the crazy trifecta of shit going on right now. So, but I love this movie. I'm super excited to talk about it because it's just such a great classic. And I hadn't seen it in so long. So I giggled through the whole thing. I love it. It was a great throwback and fun to watch. So thank you for pulling this out of your bag of tricks.
Hey, you know what? No problem. And believe me, Moni, if anybody's had to deal with shit shows, it's been Kinte over all these years. So this is totally going to roll off his back. Y'all acting a fool. Now, anybody who's been listening to this podcast knows that for the most part, when my turn comes around, I tend to err on the side of reviewing movies. And a lot of times that I do reviews, there are movies that I haven't seen. But I've always mentioned this. Return of the Living Dead has always been my favorite horror movie just because it doesn't take itself seriously, and it, in a great way, it kind of, pays homage to, this style of filmmaking. So it's always been close to my heart, and I like to laugh. There are certain things, and maybe Kinte can back me up on this. Sometimes when you have something in the horror genre that takes itself too seriously, it ends up being comedic because they're not good at executing it, which was one of the things that I had kind of come to the conclusion of concerning The Walking Dead and shows like that. I'd like Z Nation because they were basically mocking, all of the things that people were taking seriously, in The Walking Dead. So 1985 was definitely an interesting year. And a lot of the other movies that came out, there were actually a ton of horror movies that came out in 1985, but Fright Night, Nightmare on Elm Street, Day of the Dead, and Cat's Eye are a few. and I'm pretty sure that everybody here is familiar with all of those titles. So surprisingly enough, we love to check things like Rotten Tomatoes. It's 91% on there, and it's a movie that actually did fairly well. I mean, it had a budget of $4 million. It made 14.2. So at least for me, I think that that's pretty successful, especially given the content that's in the movie from 1985. But overall, I think, and Kinte, we did a review of Return of the Living Dead on Cinema du Fromage. What was it, like a few weeks ago?
Yeah, it was a few weeks ago, and for the longest, it ranked in the top 2 for our show. So, yeah, and I hadn't seen it since I was a child or a teenager, and it was so much fun watching it again. I didn't remember how good it was because I just hadn't seen it since I was probably a teenager. So, yeah. It was fun.
And it's actually, Christy, you mentioned that you hadn't seen it in ages, and you just rehashed that, Kinte. But isn't it funny that when you haven't seen it in a while and you watch it, you're like, this was better than I was thinking I was going to get when you initially pop it in? Because I think I have this movie on VHS. I've got it on DVD. I've got it on Blu-ray. And I have a copy of a copy that I made that somebody else had. So
yeah, totally. And I was trying to remember this movie, and then there was another movie. I think it was called Ghoulies. That is just totally over the top stupid. But those two, when I growing up, I think I was 10 when this movie came out. I watched over and over again when I was young, and it's just. And when I look back now and I look at a lot of the movies that, like Shaun of the Dead, that's one of my favorite horror movies. Honestly, I don't think that movie would exist if it wasn't for this movie. It's such a tongue-in-cheek play on zombies, and just the humor that ties around it is not the same, but kind of in the same concept of, the zombie genre. So I was sitting here thinking, like Housebound, like these horror movies that don't take themselves seriously. I think a lot of that came from this movie. I don't remember another movie like this before it, and maybe I'm wrong, but where it was horror, but it was done, you're like scared, but you're also laughing, and it's cheesy and silly, and just overall, just a great, concept of horror.
Yeah, and definitely the epitome of 1985. And these are some things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But before we actually start breaking down the actual movie, I just want to go around real quickly. Were there any characters that tended to be your favorite? Now, I can tell you, hands down, Frank was my favorite. I mean, he's the one who just has me constantly laughing throughout the whole thing, and laughing just mainly because Frank and Freddie are terrified at what's going on, and of course everybody who they bring in the fold is terrified as well. But Frank is just so over the top. It's really kind of refreshing, his interaction with Freddie as well. So Christy, did you have any personal favorites?
I would say I liked Freddie just because he, when he turns, it was funny to watch him like trying to get his girlfriend, and it just cracked me up. And they both, like you said, they're kind of bungling, and he was probably my favorite. And for me, he was there from the beginning to the end, and yeah, I mean, Frank just full on like burned himself up, didn't he? He just like jumped in the frickin' thing, and then but Freddie was going after his girlfriend, trying to, I'm sorry, I tried to eat you, honey, let me in, your brain smells so good. And I was just like she's gonna be like, okay. But it was just good. No, I liked Freddie the best, and I did like, and I can't think of his name, but the punk guy.
He was Chuck? I'm looking at him too. He was one of my favorites, but
he was like, nobody Chuck? Understands me, like this like hardcore punk guy, just so misunderstood, and he was like one of the first to go, but I liked him too. Well,
actually, hold on, Kinte, wasn't as many times I've seen his name, was it Was Suicide the one that was
that's the one.
Trash's boyfriend? I think it was Suicide.
Yeah, I think Suicide's the guy.
But
Suicide. Let me see, because I'm looking at the still photos on IMDb, and they only show like everybody in them, so that doesn't help. But Chuck, the ones with Chuck has that punk guy. Let's see, Suicide.
Now, mind you, like Trash, who was the young lady who took all her clothes off.
Yeah.
The scene where she was grinding against that guy, that was supposed to be her boyfriend, even though it's not explicitly, stated.
Oh.
Okay, it is Suicide. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Just looking at the quotes.
So what about you, Kinte? Who do you ride with?
I really like Frank. One is James Cameron's a really great actor, but I guess I didn't realize that her name was Trash, but I love the naked girl for no reason.
Linnea Quigley.
Yeah.
It just epitomizes that era of horror films, where it's just the gratuitous nudity, and she's, all of a sudden she's just so hot to trot that she just has to take her clothes off in the cemetery. I think that's hilarious.
But you have to think about it. Think of all of us guys. I know, Moni, you could probably roll your eyes at all of us dudes. Like, that was another reason why that body was banging.
Oh no, yeah, it is. And she's naked the whole movie. I loved it too. It was just like ridiculous. So I was like, oh, we're getting clothes taken off right off the bat. Oh, and we're gonna stay that way. Okay, I like it. It's good.
She's just running around in a t-shirt with her ass hanging out. It was great.
So was there anybody that stuck out to you, Moni?
Yeah, I was gonna say. Now I just lost his name. Her boyfriend, who was my favorite. So. Punk, like, I'm into punk music, and if I didn't have to pay the bills, I would be dressing like that and hanging out like that, basically. Well, not with my clothes off, but with clothes on. And so, yeah, Suicide. So I just loved, like, you think I dress this way? You think this is a costume? Like, because I go to so many punk shows, and that's, people kind of take themselves a little seriously sometimes. Like, I love wearing, a belt that has maybe some spikes or something like that, and having crazy colored hair. But that's why it just makes me laugh, like, the degrees, like whatever you're into, the people that are super hardcore into it, they just sort of roll your eyes, so he made me laugh a lot.
Okay. Well, what's up? So I'm pretty sure that we'll sing the praises of these characters as we move on. So let's go ahead and dive into the review. Unless, did any of you have any weird news or anything you wanted to do before we dive in? Or are we good?
I mean, I have a good story about solving the murder of Jaws, but I feel like we're talking about this movie right now, and I don't want to stop the pace. So.
Well, that's what's up. Maybe. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
No, the only thing I was going to mention is that we hit over 20,000 downloads, so I was happy 20,000 downloads to you guys. Of course, at 10 we were celebrating, and now we're like, oh, it's old hat, whatever. But I was like, hey, when I got on this morning, I'm like, we hit over 20,000 downloads.
That's awesome.
That's pretty awesome.
Hey,
so congratulations
that's
to us.
Okay, well that's what's up. All right, so the movie starts off at a medical supply warehouse where Frank, who's played by James Cameron, informs his new protege, Freddie, played by Tom Matthews, that Night of the Living Dead was based on true events that occurred when a gas, it's called 2,4-dioxin. Apparently it was released in a morgue in the basement of a VA hospital in Pittsburgh. And that toxin caused the bodies to jerk around like they were alive. So the military was able to get a handle on the situation and clean up everything and all of the infected corpses. So the story was leaked, and the military said that the movie Night of the Living Dead could be made, but they had to change the story around and say it was fictional. So poor Freddie, he's all green. He doesn't necessarily buy it. So Frank ends up taking him downstairs to show him some containers that were downstairs. So Freddie's a little shook. And then he hits one of the barrels. And of course, it's right after hey, these things are really durable. They're made by the U.S. government. And he hits it. And then the barrel erupts. And it actually makes them pass out, so to speak. And as it goes around, it looks like the body in the container starts to liquefy. And then from here on out, hilarity ensues. But was this something this was one of those things that it's as funny as the movie is, you kind of find out in the third act that Frank and Freddie actually died.
Yeah.
when the toxin went off. So I thought that was kind of cool, the way that they had set that up for a little bit later. Freddie's girlfriend, her name is Tina. She's played by Beverly Randolph, and some of her friends, they're going to pick up Freddie from the warehouse. So they arrive a little bit early, and and of course, when you want to pass the time, when you're picking your friend up from work, you're going to go hang out at the cemetery. I mean, because that's the only natural thing that you would do at that age. So a little bit of time goes by, and Freddie and Frank, they end up waking up, and they see that the body that was in the container that he hit is missing, and they assume that it kind of dissolved. So they're all, they're coughing, they're sweaty, they're messed up, and they go upstairs. They want to try to sort out everything that happened, and they hear some noises. And it turns out to be a split dog anatomy cadaver that's howling. How that happens, I don't know. I definitely want Christy to explain that. And then
you want me to explain that?
They beat it. I guess you beat it to death with a crutch.
That was hysterical.
It's so hysterical. Between that and probably the what did you call those things where you put the butterflies in the frame?
Right. I can't think of them, but yeah, they're pinned to the. Yeah. Back in the day, I had to make one of those for science class, where you have styrofoam and it's in a frame, and you collect bugs and you pin the bugs and you identify what they are. Yeah. I can't remember the name of them, but yeah, that was hysterical when he was beating that half dog.
So essentially what we find out at this point is pretty much the gas is turning a lot of things that are in that warehouse that were dead or embalmed. It's kind of reanimating them, so to speak. Kinte, at this point in the movie, are you picking yourself off the floor laughing at these guys? Or to be honest with you, I think I would be acting the same way. I think if they put a camera on any of us that's on this podcast and something like this happened, we would probably be some bumbling fools as well.
Yeah. What's so funny is my mother is in town from Chicago, and it just so happened when I was watching the film again, she actually watched it with me, and me and her are sitting there dying laughing at the absurd. And my mother hates like horror stuff, right? But she because she wanted to hate it, right? Because she's like, "What are you watching?" And then we're sitting there watching it, and she's just sitting there dying laughing, and I'm laughing too. I mean, I just did not remember how funny that this movie was, and because it's so absurd and silly, and that especially that opening scene or that scene is just it's very funny.
So, Moni, are you starting to get into it at this point, or are you just kind of like, let it go a little further?
Yeah, because me, it's like things have to go boom. I was like, okay, tongue in cheek, a little bit of humor, but it really wasn't until clothes started coming off and people started dying that I really started to perk up. So
that was me last night. Sorry.
Well, you always stay consistent. So
yeah.
Now, so naturally, Frank and Freddie are panicking, and as a last resort, they end up calling their boss. Their boss's name is Bert, played by what is it, Gulager? Is that how you pronounce it, Kinte? Gulager or Moni?
Gulager.
We'll go with
Gulager. And I think that was a good decision, because I think that Freddie had suggested that they call the police or call the number for the army off the jump. Yeah. And Bert was like, nah, let's go ahead and call. I mean, and Frank was like, let's go ahead and call Bert. So they pretty much, when Bert gets there, they pretty much try to devise a plan to stop the zombie based on the method that worked in Night of the Living Dead, because there's a zombie going crazy in this closet. So they decide, hey, you know what? This is what they did in that movie. We're just going to bash it in the head. So they open up the freezer, and just Frank sitting there crying, calling for Jesus was just something that just had me just dead. Like he is so over the top, and you gotta love him, because he kind of represented the fear that I think that, anybody would have, but it's just over the top funny. And the cadaver, all of a sudden, it just runs out, and it runs straight for Bert. They wrestle it down, and then they pin, I think it's a pickaxe through his head, and the body's doing its thing. And the hilarity of watching Frank watch Bert make the decision that he's going to cut the head off of the cadaver with the bone saw. It was just so insanely ridiculous and dope. So did that make any of you like bust out laughing when Frank had to deal with the cadaver getting cut up?
Oh, I did. Frank, I mean, Frank is like, I mean, the kids also freaked out, but he, like you said, is so over the top horrified about what's happening, and he just cannot contain it. And then his boss is like, get it together, like, we got shit to do. And he's just like, oh my God, like, I would be the same way. I would be losing my shit. So, I mean, seeing him like that is just, it's really funny, because he really is just losing his fucking mind at this point, like, what's happening.
Is anybody on this panel the type of person that if something like a big crisis happens, you're the opposite of over the top? Or are there anybody here who kind of,
I mean, I could deal with that stuff because I've had like emergency situations or whatever, but definitely afterward, I'm that person. Like in my head, I'm them, but like in real life, I'm like, okay, this is what we got to do. But my head is just like an exercise and like, like, the same thing. So I totally felt them, and it was making me laugh because I was like, oh, that's my inner self. Just, being happy.
Oh, what about you, Kinte? Are you over the top, or does the situation warrant, are you pretty measured when critical things like that happen?
Yeah, I'm really measured. I'm very much a don't panic type person. So because panicking ain't gonna help. So you know what I mean. So it isn't gonna like make the situation better. So I'm very much a not panic type person, to the point where they're like, people are always asking me like, man, weren't you like worried? I'm like, in my head, yeah, of course I was worried, but I just tend to panic when crazy situations happen.
Yeah, I'm that way by default, because if something go down, it seems like for some reason everybody looks at me anyway. So I have to, I try to be that person as well. So, well, luckily that person was Bert, at least up to this situation. So once he gets there, Bert has to figure out something to do, because these two employees have totally enlightened him to the dead coming back because of this gas. So he looks out the window and ends up, he knows his friend, he has a friend, Ernie, who he went to school with, who worked across the street. He actually ran a mortuary. So they decide to go over there to try to take the body over there, explain to Ernie what's going on, and they wanted him to use the crematorium to get rid of these body parts. Now, we have to return back to the cemetery, and I know we've already talked about the naked dancing and everything that's going on, but now it's time to dig a little bit further into what's going on here. Now, Trash, who's played by Lena Quigley, she's actually talking to Spider, who's Miguel Nunez Jr. I think that's his name. She's talking to him, and of course she's talking all types of freaky things about, how I think she imagined herself dying, or how she would want to die, or the most horrifying way that she could die. And apparently it was a bunch of old men crawling all over her and eating her. And from that moment, I think everybody knows that that's how it was going.
Wishes do come true. And I'm really appreciating these gifts as we go along. They're making me laugh all over again as we're talking. So thank you for you really put a lot of effort into these show notes. I got the gifts and everything.
So, Tina's worried about Freddie naturally, because he should have been off work by now. So she, of course, has to depart and leave the group to investigate. So the discussion turns to death, and as we just talked about, Trash, she imagines the worst way for her to die, surrounded by old men and biting her to death or whatever. As she says this, she strips off all of her clothes, which Moni reiterated earlier. She keeps them off for the rest of the movie. And I think she's got on leg warmers, so she's got on a little bit of clothing at some point. But yeah, once we talked about, she kind of foreshadows her own death, which we're going to get to. So we have to go back to the warehouse, and we see Tina trying to find Freddy. She makes her way downstairs, and she's greeted by the dripping body that was in the canister from earlier. Frank and Fred thought that it dissolved. Now, this particular zombie is called Tarman, who was played by Alan Troutman, and he asked for one thing: brains. And this is the dopest zombie that's ever existed, that's ever been created. The guys
I love him so much.
Oh,
yeah.
His physicality is so creepy. And to be honest, for 1985, their practical effects I thought were pretty great. What say y'all?
Agreed. No, I have to say he's definitely probably one of my favorite characters in this whole movie. I know we asked initially and I said Freddy, but he's definitely up there too. And he's not even in the movie that much, but he is scary and also funny at the same time. Just because he's like all about, like, so about the brains, like he's excited, like really excited about it, like, you know, where zombies are supposed to be all dead and be like, he's like, yeah, brains, woo, like he's like hysterical.
Kind of want to party with him, but also not. So.
I know.
And I bet he wants to party with you.
Exactly. So do y'all think the physicality worked? Because, you know, we're so used to the lumbering zombies, they really don't do anything. And for me, I thought that the cool thing about this movie was the fact that these zombies, they can think, they can communicate, you know, and that makes them even more of a threat. Does that work for y'all, or did you totally just buy into it that it worked in this movie?
Well, and I'm watching this GIF that you have here on repeat where he pulls his head in and then bites it. That's like totally what they teach you, like in fighting classes, to like bring the head in and then, you know, knee somebody or something like that. I'm like, he's so aggressive. Like he's all about it. It's so much better than just these Walking Dead zombies that might walk past you and bite you if, you know, they get the chance. But
well, the Walking Dead zombies are prejudiced against the people who are not stars of the shows.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. No doubt.
I think that's really one of the main parts of the movie that was hard for me, is that I'm so used to the zombies that, you know, you're like, okay, this is a skeleton. How is it talking? Like, how does it even have a voice box? Like, why are its eyes still on its head if it's just a skull? You know, like those were the things
like,
that
they sure have like good, you know, reflexes
eyeballs.
And things like that. Things that are deteriorating.
Yeah, and so it was like that part of it. I was kind of like, but I knew that it's supposed to be this way. It's supposed to be dumb.
Absolutely.
Like it's not supposed to make sense. So that part of me, I just had to turn that off at the beginning, because I'm so used to making things need to make sense. But there are movies that just aren't supposed to, and this is one of them. And so once my brain turned that part of me off and I just enjoyed what I was seeing, instead of like, doesn't that works? Your eyeballs aren't this fresh when you're just a skeleton. Like, and then I'm like, oh, whatever, this is funny. And so then I got over it.
Hey, maybe the government juice that they had him in did at least a good enough job to keep the Tar Man together. But
exactly.
like all of us, the Tar Man freaked us out, just like it freaked out Tina, who ends up running out of the room and escaping to a metal locker. She bars the door from within, but the Tar Man hooks up a winding chain to the door and proceeds to kind of use it as a winch to pull the door off. Then we go back to the mortuary where Bert, Freddie, and Frank are. So they're there to talk to Ernie and trying to convince him to cremate all of the sawed up remains of the cadaver that they cut up a little bit earlier. So what ends up happening, after some hilarity, because Ernie was funny as hell too, he almost shot Bert, and he was totally freaking out. So at this point, everybody is like on their last leg of being sane, because they can't really understand why these reanimations are taking place. So, of course, Ernie ends up, agreeing, but the furnace ends up releasing the gases from the zombie that gets up in the clouds and causes it to rain. And, of course, the rain is contaminated with the toxins, forcing all of the punk rockers at the cemetery to flee. I think they were saying that it was burning their skin a little bit. Of course, they've got a convertible. It starts to leak, so they take refuge inside the warehouse. So when they get in there, they happen to hear Tina screaming from the Tar Man trying to get to her. They run to help her. seeing the door slowly being pulled off the locker, but not necessarily being able to see who's doing it. They push back the curtain blocking their view, and the tar man, of course, yells, "More brain," and then he bites off the top of Suicide's skull. Poor Trash. She lost her boyfriend fairly quickly. Did y'all even care about, I mean, I think Suicide was your favorite, right, Moni? I didn't really care for him. He seemed a little too uptight all the time.
I know, no, that's why I thought he was funny though. It's just because I know people like that in the punk scene where they're just like, "Do you think this is fun for me?" And he's like all serious. And then I thought he was gonna last a little longer because he seemed like he would be Mr. Tough Guy, but instead he just goes and like gets eaten immediately. Like,
yeah,
it just made me laugh. I was like, and there he goes.
The funny part about it is, like, you know, his girlfriend's running around naked, and he's so caught up in his own hubris.
Yes.
Like, he can't even enjoy it, and he, you know, and
No.
I just remember as a kid, I remember people literally dressing like that and walking around and being like, that was their self-expression, and we just don't
Like
really see that
emo.
anymore.
Yeah.
So it was just funny to see that, like, as an adult. I don't think when I was a kid and I saw this movie, I was looking that deeply into his character, but it cracked me up as an adult seeing it, just because I'm like, dude, your girlfriend's sitting here stark naked dancing on a grave, and you're over here like feeling sorry for yourself. You're so tortured, you poor guy. And then
No one
there he
understands
goes.
me.
Yeah, and then like one of the first to go, you know, it was just funny. I just thought that was, they played that character really well.
Well, something that we talked about on Cinema du Fromage was the fact that all of the friends, like, it just seemed like there were so many different types of people that probably never would have been friends in real life. Because you had the punkers, and then you had, you know,
Freddie.
Yeah. So
like,
it's like, you know, what's really going on here?
Freddie
But
with his wife beater and his suspenders, or whatever the hell that shirt was. He had like that muscle shirt and suspenders. And I laughed. That's the first thing I noticed when the movie started, was his outfit. And I was like, oh my God, what in the hell is he? Like, what's that supposed to be? And then I'm like, oh yeah, we're in the 80s. It was ridiculous back then.
Well, the other thing that showed you is in the 80s, and I know Kinte cannot identify with this, but then you had Spider, where it had, people had like the feathers in their hair. I totally remember.
I had those, not knowing what they were. The roach clips. Like, I had those all in my hair. I got in trouble at school, and they were like, I'm like, what? Like, you can't wear feathers in your hair? And they had to explain to me what they were. I had no idea.
Yep. Oh my gosh, those were so
Shout
good.
out to Miguel Nunez, who you know, was the brother, made it all the way through the movie. But also, I think it was the same year, he was the first black person to get killed by Jason in the Friday the 13th movie. So he's very proud of that, by the way.
Oh man, I love that. Thanks for that. That's some awesome trivia there.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever realized that though. But, you say he's wearing it as a badge of honor?
Yeah. Like, I've seen him in interviews, like, brag about, I'm the first brother to get killed by Jason.
Awesome.
Now, so Tina, hilarious. She's escaping the locker because of Suicide's demise, and she runs down to join her friends as they escape the basement. So they all make a run for the mortuary, having seen some people enter it earlier that day. So during this time, of course, the rain has been seeping into the ground, and as a result, of course, the coffins and the corpses start erupting, causing everything in them to reanimate. The group ends up kind of setting themselves up in the entrance of a mausoleum. They can hear the muffled screams and, you know, the pounding and the dead coming up out of the earth. As they're sitting around listening, they spot the skeletal remains of a corpse riding from the ground, and its eyes open, the jaw drops, and of course the rock and roll music starts blasting out throughout the whole thing. So the group runs in a panic, and they all split up, because you definitely got to have this so you can pick them off separately in a horror movie. So they do this, heading for the mortuary. all of the punkers pretty much end up, after all of that, they end up heading back to the warehouse, and Trash, who remained behind, of course, she got her wish, and she ends up, getting eaten by all of the really, really, really old men. Now, something that I thought was really dope about this movie is I think for the first time in horror, we actually got an explanation of the motivations behind something like a zombie. Like, that really never happens, and we kind of find this out when I think it was who was it who had knocked that zombie out? Let me see. Okay, well, to make a long story short, they end up getting a zombie, and it was actually a zombie that was torn in half that was trying to get them. And they essentially just asked the zombie, why are you doing what you're doing? And she said that eating brains stops the pain of being dead, which I thought was really sad. So that means when you die, you still are feeling the pain of feeling yourself rot. That's pretty gruesome, to be honest. Is that something that kind of made y'all feel like, wow, that's, wow. That's
why this dead lady got to be such a downer? I mean, we're sitting here laughing, looking at naked women running around and watching people get their brains eaten. Next thing you know, she's like, the pain of being dead. I'm like, yeah.
Wah, wah. No, yeah, absolutely. And this is where I was like, how is she talking? She been dead. Her vocal box. Yes. Then I had to be like, nope. I do have.
Look at the control she has with her spine. How is it in such good shape?
That was weird. The spine flopping around.
Yeah, it's like a tail. Like your spine turns into a tail after you die. I don't know. It was weird.
I have to give one critique on this movie that really, and this did bug me, and I didn't ever get over it, was Trash getting eaten and then emerging from the cemetery, like, in perfect condition. And, like, looking like she's getting ready to try out for, like, an MTV video. She's walking around in smoke and all white with this cool hair. And I was like, where's the bites? She's dead.
Can't cover that body up. Christy, don't you understand?
They should have played it differently then. They should have played her death differently, because they were like, oh, she's going to get eaten. And then she comes out of the cemetery and she looks all perfect, and her body, and all, those homeless people are like, damn.
Hey, they wanted to enjoy it. They gave her a bunch of hickeys and kept it moving.
There you go. I guess that's how we roll.
At all.
Of course you didn't.
Didn't they just put a couple of streaks that were supposed to look like dirt? I think that was the best that they did with her.
She just went and got eaten up by half the cemetery and then walked out of there looking like she was getting ready for a Playboy centerfold. I was like, well,
so
death becomes her.
So we move on from the punk rockers, and during this time in the mortuary, Frank and Freddie are starting to feel a little sick, and they're starting to actually look ill by this point. So Ernie, who was the guy at the mortuary, he ends up calling the paramedics. So Tina, Spider, and Scuzz end up showing up through all that chaos, and they're pretty much letting them know that there are bodies that are getting up out of the ground in the cemeteries. So the paramedics arrive to take care of Freddie and Frank, and they arrive near the entrance, and they find, by all medical reasoning, when examining those guys, that Frank and Freddie are dead and shouldn't be moving around. And Kinte and I talked about this on the other show, and I know that y'all probably died laughing, but he was like, I think you've got rigor mortis.
Yeah.
He's like, rigor mortis?
Yeah.
I was rolling out. At this point, I'm kind of feeling sorry for those guys because they're really looking ill. So, of course, they're like, hey, we want to get you to the hospital. You're freaks. We want to get you further tested. And then they went to go get a stretcher and to report it to the dispatch. And then they're, of course, attacked by the zombies who were in the graveyard. And one of the zombies clearly says, send more paramedics, which I thought was pretty dope.
That was funny.
I mean, that is awesome. And we actually kind of had flipped a few things, because actually after that was when the zombie had revealed that, being dead was the reason why they had eaten brains in particular. And I thought, Moni, I mean, I know you're a stickler for, effects and things like that, but how do you think that they did as far as practical effects in 1985 for this movie?
Uh-oh, she might have dropped. I know she was saying she was having problems.
About 50% of everything that's been said since we started. I'm sorry. Can you just run that last part by me again? Because now I can hear you again.
Oh, okay. No, I was saying we actually were talking about after, the paramedics were checking out Frank and Freddie, and then they got the diagnosis that they're dead, so to speak. We know that the paramedics put them in, and then, they go out to get a stretcher to take them back to the hospital for more tests. And then we were talking about how the zombie was saying send more cops, and that we had kind of flipped it, because the thing where the zombie was revealing, that the reason why they went for brains was it stopped it helped with the pain of being dead. Mm-hmm. I was just asking, what did you think? Because I know you're all about the, murder, death, kill, and the practical effects. But how did you think that they did on practical effects back in 1985 on this film?
I think it was pretty brilliant, honestly. I mean, as we mentioned, the problems with the functionality of these zombies, but as after you suspend your disbelief, they look amazing. So it's like that they can do all those things, and they really went teeth and eyes. I feel like that was a big part of like what made these zombies so successful, was they come at you and it's just giant eyes, and then of course teeth, which you have to be fearful of. So, and I love that, and we haven't gotten quite to this yet, but when they say to send more cops or whatever, that the zombies have enough like brains, they're able to lure other, come here, this is where we need help, and then they all like jump out and jump on everybody.
Excellent problem solvers, that's for sure.
Yeah, I've never seen that in a zombie film before. So
oh my gosh. And they run full speed, so they can talk, they can run full speed, and they can talk trash to you. You know what I mean? I don't know. Just be a mindless beast if you're gonna rip me apart, but don't be talking shit. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's kind of the last straw. Now, as we know, at this point in the movie, all types of chaos is ensuing. In addition, the police have been sent to investigate the two ambulances that aren't reporting, because of course, when the zombie said, send another ambulance, they get bum rushed. So, of course, when the cops show up, it's the same thing. And, you get to send more cops. So it's just kind of a circular thing that's happening. And Frank and Freddie are slowly becoming zombies. And they decide to go to the chapel area, and to be sealed in. So Tina stays with Freddie, who ends up dying. Well, would either of you ladies have stayed if you knew that they were turning?
Hell no.
Okay.
Even if it's your man, it's like, well, you can't do him any good if you get dead with him. Like, go try to figure something out. I don't know.
You women are not loyal. You would not.
I cannot get help for my man if I'm dead. That's all I'm saying.
Worse.
Exactly, Kinte. Exactly.
Mm-mm.
And Moni and Christy have just said.
We didn't say for better and zombies. Okay, that's not worse.
That's the part, not person hit me in a locked room that I locked myself in. Like, come on.
Kinte, you should have heard them. I think, what was the movie with was it Martin Freeman, that flick, the zombie one that was on Netflix that we watched?
Oh yeah.
Now we all
dude, just do it.
Good. Yeah, I heard it's really good, right?
Did you? I mean, it was. I thought it was cool, but there's a scene in that, Kinte, where I definitely have to agree with the ladies here. Like, you kind of set yourself up and your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you knew.
Tell your wife, do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay.
In those circumstances, of course.
Well, that's established. Y'all are bouncing on y'all's man, so we got that on tape. But
tell him.
So, now one of the saddest parts of this was, as we're talking about Tina staying with Freddie, he ends up dying, and of course he reanimates and tries to attack her. We've seen this play out a million times since 1985 in movies involving zombies. So she's screaming for help, and the others try to come to help her, and Freddie ends up getting acid splashed in his eyes, and they manage to push him back and kind of lock him inside the chapel. At this point, it goes back to Frank, who has just totally had it. He's like, he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't feel well. He knows that he's, people are telling him he's dead. He's seeing, reanimated corpses coming back. So he just kind of says, you know what? I'm going to say my prayers, and then I'm going to, I don't want to turn all the way into one of those things. So he puts himself in the crematorium thing. He puts himself in the furnace, and he ends up incinerating himself. And I was sad when that happened. It was just kind of, it's kind of messed up. I mean, would y'all have burnt yourself? I don't think I could have done it.
That's a pretty. There are other ways to die. Well, I guess he wanted to make sure that he didn't come back, but still, that was.
Yes.
That was harsh.
He had just seen all those parts moving, independently. They wouldn't die, and I think he knew this was probably just the only way that he could completely be gone. And he's dead, so it's not like, it's like, I guess it was sad for sure. And I just cringed, like watching somebody, even though he's supposed to be dead, still like putting yourself in a crematorium and burning yourself alive is not like, out of all the funniness of the movie, it was definitely kind of like, whoa. I mean, I cringed because I definitely would never, I would not want to go out burning alive. That's for sure.
I think if I was diagnosed with a slight case of rigor mortis, I might have to do the same. Because that was pretty bad. And the way that he just went in there, and I remember, I remember hearing something about, he wanted to go out. I'm talking about the actor wanted his character to go out that way. That I think they had another way that he was going to die, and he thought that the actor himself came up with that way to go out.
That's awesome.
Definitely memorable, yeah.
Yeah. So now we've got Bert and Spider who are trying to make a run for it to the car, and they're able to get in and move it to the door of the mortuary. And they quickly, of course, become surrounded by all the zombies that are outside, and they end up having to leave without everybody else. They're able to make their way to the warehouse where they can try to, phone more police to warn them, of the situation so that they, stop sending all of these police that are getting chewed up. But the first wave of police, they set up a blockade around the area of the cemetery, and they sent in several squad cars, which are directed into the scene by a zombie wearing a policeman's rain gear. So back at the warehouse, Casey and Chuck, they meet Bert and Spider, and they talk to them. They report that they trapped a zombie in the office. Now, and I think that's Tarman or whatever that's in the office. So unfortunately, the telephone is in the same office, of course, and Bert suggests using the one in the basement, but all of the punk rockers tell him about, the Tarman. Okay, that's it. He's down in the basement. And Bert says that they have to try anyway. So they end up knocking Tarman's head off with a bat as they open the door, and this kind of gives him a little time to get to the phone. So Bert proceeds to call the police, and he asks to speak to the person in charge of the blockade, and after they're connected, the zombies rush the blockade, and we see the commander taken down by the unzombified trash, as Christy talked about earlier. So finally, it all came down to it. They were pretty disheartened to do it by the noises that were coming from the other side of the phone, because you could tell that things were happening there. He ends up calling the government number on the side of the barrel that Frank and Freddie had ruptured earlier in the movie. So he ends up talking to Colonel Horace Glover, who's played by Jonathan Terry, who gets the information from Bert about the location, the time of the occurrence, the number of zombies that he estimated, and all types of things like that. So he's transferred again, and he explains to the punkers that apparently the army had been expecting something like this to happen for a long time, and they had a contingency plan in place to deal with it. So back at the mortuary, Ernie and Tina have escaped the attic area of the embalming room, and Freddie, of course, breaks out of the chapel screaming for Tina's brains. He attempts to break in. The whole time he's talking to Tina about being able to smell her brain and how badly he is damaging himself to get her. Now, the colonel is connected to an artillery post that ends up providing the coordinates and clearance to launch a small yield nuclear attack from artillery that's somewhere near that cemetery. All of these scenes of all these different characters that we like or loathe, they kind of culminate with the sound of a nuclear shell being fired. Bert's still on hold on the phone. We've got Freddie in the attic with Ernie pointing a gun at Tina's head, planning on killing her and himself to avoid being eaten. You see the zombies standing and staring at the sky. You hear the whistle of the shell falling. And finally, we get a shot of a nuclear explosion. And for the most part, the film just ends with the general stating to his superiors that the strike seems to be successful and that reports are coming in of the only side effects being a little acid rain. So the general assures his supporters that this won't affect the president's trip to Louisville the next day. And then we're taken to a scene of a darkened cemetery and a skeletal zombie rising from the grave. So, as Kinte stated earlier, the brother made it through the movie, only get killed by the government anyway. Everybody.
Sorry, it's just funny.
I mean, everybody in this movie, and I thought that was kind of sad because that's another morbid part of it, is you realize that all of these people, at the end of the day, they all died, and that this
and
whole
it starts over again in a bigger spot. Yeah,
it is such a trip. So Moni, I mean, you had never seen this before. Was that something that kind of shocked you that they would end it that way? And did it? I mean, how'd you feel about that ending? Did you think it worked?
Yeah, you guys know me by now. I like endings that aren't necessarily happy ones. I mean, the bombing was, I was like, did they just actually, oh my God, so harsh. But then when the acid rain came and we see the other body rising from the grave, I was like, this is so awesome. It just, nowadays they have to do shit like that because, there's got to be a sequel and then a third one and they have to make all kinds of money. But I thought it was just cool to see them do it kind of organically. That's the way that should have ended, in my opinion.
Hey, we're there. You know what? Since we're pretty much, we've wrapped up the movie pretty much in a nutshell. Now, there's a lot of little things that are in it that we didn't necessarily touch on. But before we close this thing out and find out what Christy's going to do next week, just want to talk about any highlights or any favorite parts of the movie to you. So for me, I think Bert burning himself up in the furnace, that was definitely something that was like, oh man, that's messed up. I liked him. I meant Frank burning himself up in the furnace. You're so invested in those characters at that point. Then of course the extreme, as Moni had mentioned, the nuking of the town at the end. But number one, the thing that stood out was of course trash.
Sorry.
That body rock TV body.
I'll tell you what.
I'll never forget that. But
I bet as a kid you were like, "What's happening down
absolutely.
there?"
Yeah,
I'm all about it. And also,
going on down there.
I also want to add the zombie that was cut in half that kind of gave us the motivations behind what they did, because I don't think do either of you. I know Christy and Moni, y'all are all about the horror. Has anything like that happened since then, or? I don't know. Can't really remember.
I can't think of anything.
I don't know anything like that. The thing that got me though, and you kind of touched on this, is the hopelessness. Because there's a certain point of this movie where you realize, because everything that they do, like when they try to burn the body, it makes it worse.
Yeah.
And when they, when the cops come, they get all taken out. And it's like, and then in the end they get all blown up. And it's really the hopelessness of it is like, these people are doomed. They have no shot at survival. And that's the thing that's kind of crazy about this film. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, it's sexy, it's scary, it's or at least creepy. And then, it's got some deeper themes of the government will just blow up a whole town in order to, and they won't even look into what it could cause afterward. And, it's dark as well. It's, Shaun of the Dead, Christy mentioned it earlier, was to me one of the first horror films that made it funny and sad, his mom dying and that kind of stuff. And actually creepy and really well written. I just didn't know that basically without this movie, something like that probably could never have been made.
Yeah. I think what I like about this movie is, honestly, for me, when I think about all the zombie movies that I've seen, is the concept of how these zombies came to be is probably, in my mind, the most realistic concept out there. I could totally see like the government bumbling like some experiment and then accidentally sending, the canisters trying to get rid of it and hide it to something else, and something like this like spawning a disaster. Like to me, I could totally see this happening instead of some of the other ways like viruses or whatever. I mean, sure, that could happen, but for me, like this one was like such a great concept.
Yeah.
So that overall was like what really stands out to me about this movie is the
We've
concept
covered
of it.
stories like that before on this podcast,
Yeah.
where scientifically, the science community has said that, reanimation of bodies is technically possible. Not quite the thinking physically mobile ones that we see in this film, but definitely, you could do electrical currents or this or that, like, that the bodies are wiggling around, like we said at the beginning, or something like that could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something that we've seen, and also just the fact that something that kind of hits home, and apparently this goes back decades and decades since people have been, since governments and militaries deal with chemical and biological weapons. What people don't realize is you have to have an active program because, a lot of times these things kind of degrade, and you have to have a way of disposing of the thing. So I think a lot of us probably roll around and say that's so government-like for them to just leave this stuff, sitting around forever.
Problem, no.
and actually, Christy can attest, what was it, like a year or so ago, or maybe 2 years ago, when we had that fire on the I-85 because they left all those chemicals, under, like nobody stored those correctly or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think some of that kind of hits home, and like I know that type of crap could happen.
Absolutely. I mean, they were storing barrels and barrels of chemicals under a fucking bridge. Like, how stupid can you be? Under the busiest highway in Atlanta. And so shockingly, a homeless person, tries to create a little home under there and sparks a fire, and these fucking canisters catch on fire. And of course they try to blame the poor homeless dude, like he knew what the fuck that was in there, and not pointing to the fingers of what the fuck were those barrels doing there to begin with. I mean, seriously, like that shit happens, and that shut us down. Like we could not
for
go
months,
to work.
Yeah, I don't think that they ever even. I don't recall anybody being punished for negligence of doing that.
Man.
But no, I'm saying
that was it. Yeah.
Well, I know about that,
Bullshit.
but I'm saying like I don't remember anybody saying that the person, like why the barrels were there. There has to be somebody that was responsible for those barrels being up there. I don't remember anybody losing their jobs over that, and I thought that was pretty sad. So I can attest. I know that this type of thing could definitely can definitely happen. But, all in all, for me, this movie hit close to home in a lot of ways because, I was younger, but, the fashion, just everything that was going on resonated with me because I had that soft mind, back then. And this has definitely been a movie that's been close to my heart as far as horror, just because it doesn't take itself seriously, but it does have some serious things in it if you kind of peel the skin back, a little bit. So all in all, I guess we'll just do our ratings and then talk about what's going to happen next week. For me, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5, and the only reason why I don't give it a perfect score is nothing is perfect, but I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think it has a lot of replay value. If I watch this movie in 15 years, it's going to rock just as much. So we'll just go around the panel. What about you, Christy?
I was going to give it a 4 too. It's a solid 4. Not only because it's got such great just memories, but because it really is, you're right, it's solid. When you watch it, of course it's done in the 80s and you've got all the 80s characters, but you could easily make this movie today with just, millennial characters. So it
would be way less interesting.
It would be way less interesting. It really does stand the test of time. It's a great movie just to watch, and I completely forgot about it, and so I'm glad you brought it up for us to watch because I just was giggling through the whole thing. It was really funny, and I love movies that make me laugh and are kind of horrifying at the same time because, like you said, easily could happen. Easily. So, definitely a 4.
Okay, Kinte, what you got?
Definitely, I give it a 4 out of 5. The movie is funny, likable characters. The special effects were really great, especially for that time. And it's very hard to really grapple with that movie because it's just so much pleasure in it. And I liked it so much. I actually, after I watched it, and we did the review of it, I actually watched the second one. I didn't watch anyone past that, and I actually enjoyed the second one. It wasn't as good, obviously, as the first, but it had some memorable moments as well. So, but it definitely made me want to kind of get a little bit more. I was watching the trailer for the third and the fourth one. I'm like, nah,
I didn't even know they had a third and a fourth. Damn.
Yeah, they have to make money, right?
Yeah, but I haven't. I'll be honest, I haven't seen the third or the fourth one, so I can't even vouch one way or the other. Now, Moni, what you got?
I feel like challenge accepted for starters, where I have to watch 3 and 4 now just to be like contrary, like see if it's at Jeepers Creepers 2 or 3 level to watch the rest of these.
That's true.
But yeah, I would give it a 4. This was a pleasant surprise. I feel like I've seen it or parts of it. I mean, I feel like how can a horror movie fan avoid this film like in entirety? There's a couple scenes that are a couple things that just fall apart a little bit in terms of like they're just sort of running around and like it's not something you have to focus on 100%. I was kind of reading something off and on while I was watching this, but I actually kind of appreciate that because focus is not my strong point. But yeah, for all the reasons you guys mentioned, the humor and the dark parts and all that kind of stuff, definitely a solid 4.
Okay, well, while we have you up to bat, how can people find you on social media?
For me, it is Moni Bear on Instagram and Rebel Moni on Twitter.
All right, Kinte, how can everyone find you on social media?
Real quick question. You guys did Jeepers Creepers?
Oh, yeah, we did.
Thanks, Moni.
That's the running joke. We watched the third one, and it was so bad that everything that we watched that's bad, we're like, but it's no Jeepers Creepers 3, okay?
Yeah.
I actually loved the Jeepers Creepers movie.
But, I love
the first one, yeah, it's amazing,
yes,
and the second one too.
Great. Yeah,
is okay,
they were good.
The third one, not as much.
Third one, not so much. Yeah.
No.
But you know about the director, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we talked about that too.
She gave a swan song on that.
Yeah, we have to ruin all fun things with terrible things in Hollywood. Apparently these days, that's a whole other.
Yeah. But yeah, when I heard Jeepers Creepers, it's one of my faves.
Yeah.
All right, so you can get me at Kinte F on Twitter. You can go to our website, which is indyradio.org. That's INDYradio.org. Thank you so much. I love talking about this film, and thank you for having me.
You got to come back, Kinte. This was fun.
Yeah.
Sure. Anytime.
So my turn?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on.
First, I'm going to say next week, okay, I'm going to talk about Roswell. I grew up in Roswell. It's my home. My parents still live there. And the whole reason why I made this podcast was because of where I grew up, my roots. And I think I'm going to do it. It's really is a big project for me. And I'm hoping I'm going to have the time because I'm ready to like really dive into it and talk about it and discuss it. But it, like I said, I take it really seriously because I did grow up there. And, so I think that's what I'm going to talk about next week, unless I just can't get to it. But that's my intention is for us to finally talk about Roswell. So, that's the plan next week. What's that?
The incident or the TV show?
The incident where I grew up. Yeah. Roswell crash. And so with that, you can find me at creepin_it on Twitter and Creepin Christy on Instagram. And I'd love for you guys to come hang out with us on Twitter. Y'all over here downloading all our shit, but I have no idea who you are or where you come from or any of your other things about you. So by all means, follow us and reach out and say hi.
And yeah, and also, you can find the Creepin' and Real show on, I just found out we're on Stitcher too.
Yeah.
Stitcher, Podbean, and iTunes. There are lots of formats. And as she mentioned, we have a Facebook page, The Creeping and Real Show. And I would probably have to say, I don't think there's as much activity on the Instagram, and probably that's probably like, my fault.
It's mine
But-
too.
I remember how to log in there. I do it on Facebook because I know I have the login automatically set up. It makes it easy
Yeah.
for me to be lazy, but
I mean, that's my fault too. I have like my Instagram, creeping Instagram, my work Instagram. I can't do it all, and I just was
well,
like,
here you
all
go.
right.
I'll do the Facebook mostly, and then you do the Twitter mostly, and then Yardley can do the Instagram mostly.
Yeah. I think that's how we're.
Division of labor.
Yeah, I definitely think that's how we're gonna roll it. And you know something? I'm hypnotized by this GIF of that zombie
I know, right?
in the show notes. I'm just
We
sitting
need
there
a better
staring at it.
nude gif though for trash. Like she's
Yeah.
topless, but it's kind of far away. We need the whole
Yeah.
like trash dancing gif.
Hey,
Yeah.
I want her boobs.
I,
Just
I want her
as an
boobs and I
insider
want her
comment.
boobs. I don't even know.
Yeah.
Take that however
She's-
you will.
I want her boobs
She's still dancing.
on me and in my hands. At the same time.
if you guys need help, I'll man your Black Planet page.
Yeah, exactly. Now, all right. Well, everybody. Till next time, keep it real, and you'll hear from us very soon.
Nowhere to run, nothing to hide from the government's prying eye. Take yourself a summer holiday, get some time away from the brain. Welcome to 1980.